Thank you for attending this session. It's a privilege to be able to present to new fellows. And this is going to be a bit of a gear change for you all from the past talk. So I want you just perhaps to sit back and imagine a gentle pastoral landscape with sheep and cattle grazing, happy in their fields. Because that's the kind of career that I've had, working in the grassland sector of New Zealand and Australian agricultural industries. And so part of my challenge is to make the growing of grass sound interesting. You all know, what's as interesting as watching paint dry or watching grass grow. So that is a challenge, but it is interesting. It's interesting to some of us. Maybe we have a sad life that we've found it interesting. My career really started, well, I would describe my career as being applied science. I started, I would say, perhaps in the more basic end of applied science, literally spending hours on hands and knees studying the individual growth processes of grass and clover plants in mixtures such as this. Now, we actually tagged plants with little markers and went back and relocated those every week and measured the growth processes of them. So we understood the flux of material that was flowing through plants, both grasses and clovers, how they were responding to environmental stresses, and what this meant for how we might manage grassland communities like this. Nowadays, you'd probably do it with microchips or something in the base of these plants. It would be so much easier than spending hours on your hands and knees studying. More recently, my career has progressively moved into more applied science, and particularly the last 10 years of my career with Dairy NZ was very applied. Dairy NZ is an organisation many of you may not know it's a business that's owned by dairy farmers, courtesy of their levy on every kilogram of milk solids produced goes into Dairy NZ for reinvestment in research and development. And Dairy NZ retains a small science team, but by and large, most of the investment that it makes is in universities, Crown Research Institutes, and other organisations that can deliver the science and technology that's useful for the industry, or important for the industry. So applied science, what do we mean by that? I mean, Rod's given us a good example of applied science, developing technologies, solutions, or exploring opportunities. And so my research has been in the last, to use an example, in the last 10 years has been very heavily focused, in fact 15 years, on how we ameliorate the environmental effects of nutrients in the environment from grazing systems. Very topical. It is an issue throughout many regions of New Zealand, and it is related to intensive grassland agriculture as we practice it. There is no question about that. So to address this problem, we're looking for solutions that are based on, first of all, known principles. In this case, we might say, well, let's understand the basic plant nutritional physiology of the plants that we use, how they acquire nutrients, how they utilise those nutrients, where the nutrients grow in the system. We need that principle understanding to build the solutions. And from there, we move into what you might call proof of concept. So if we, for example, explore the use of alternative forms of nutrients at alternative times in the growth cycle of plants, can we manipulate the nutrient flow as a result of that? So you can do that in a proof of concept study. It might be in the field, it might be in the laboratory and so on. But ultimately you want to take it into proof of practice. That's where it demonstrates in a commercial farm system with all of the pressures that are associated with that it does actually work, and that farmers can have confidence that if they go down this pathway, they will be able to sustain a profitable business and they will meet environmental goals. So that's kind of the nub of what we've been trying to do. And the latter part of that, the applied proof of practice, is clearly best done in collaboration with farmers, believe it or not. It's simple, but it makes sense. If you do it otherwise, then you do it in a vacuum that doesn't necessarily take into account how farmers view the world, how they make decisions, why they change or why they don't change. So a large part of our work has been to move proof of concept into proof of practice and do it with farmers, and then get adoption and change. Ultimately, we want to see change in the industry. That's what it's about. So that's a little bit of a snapshot of more recent times, but I want to take you somewhere else completely just to run through a few points about where we've arrived in the grassland science community in New Zealand, and a few thoughts about where we need to go. And I want to start with competitive advantage. And it's important in this context because New Zealand is an export-led economy. We do rely on high-value exports going into markets around the world that bring in export revenue that drives our economy. And in terms of the animal protein industry, so you can think of red meat, you can think of dairy, it's always been understood really from the beginning of the development of those industries that being able to feed animals on pastures directly is our competitive advantage. It means that there's a low cost of production of those products, which means when they get into international markets, they're very competitive on price. And as long as quality characteristics are up to scratch, then they have a very good market position. Other countries that are producing the same products don't have the same environments that they can allow animals to graze outdoors, free range, if you like, for most of the year. They have to incur higher costs of production by bringing feed to those animals. So competitive advantage is very important to us. And that got me thinking, well, how much should a sector or industry or business invest in maintaining its competitive advantage or building its competitive advantage? So I tried to think of an example from commerce that might give us some clues about this. And my mind landed on Volvo. Strangely enough, it's a long way from grass and clover plants to car manufacturing. But what's Volvo known for? Safety, thank you. So the first thing you might, as many of you have, identified with Volvo is safety. And that has been clearly a huge focus for the company since it started in 1927 until more modern times, even now, still striving to reduce the accident rate by the development of technologies in their vehicles that provide safety for the driver and passengers and others around. So how much does Volvo spend on maintaining its competitive advantage of safety? Well, these figures are taken with a bit of a grain of salt. It's pretty hard to find this information on the internet when you go looking for it, but the best I could find was that Volvo Cars has an annual R&D budget of about 2.2 billion on sales of about 70 billion per year, so about 3.2%. And if we said only about a third of this now goes on safety, that's probably about 1% of its revenue is going back into R&D on safety. In our New Zealand pasture sector, we're currently investing somewhere around 0.13 to 0.26 of the export revenue generated by those industries, which is about 34 billion. That's its contribution to our export revenue nationally. This is not a plea for more funding. Please, we're all up against a funding barrier in everything we do. This is just trying to put some context on what should we be doing. If these are important industries for our country and they're based on the pasture system, what should we be doing? And of the estimated investment in New Zealand, about half of that is private investment through, for example, plant breeding companies, which is really important. It's a major contributor to the industry, but it means the discretionary amount of funding that's available for projects related to industry strategic priorities is actually less than that. So it's a tight equation, and it means we've got to be lean and mean in what we do. So competitive advantage, that's the big picture. The next thing that is clearly important in the development of our industries is change, because change is coming, we all know that. Volvo has had to change. Safety alone isn't enough. Our pasture systems are going to have to change as well. Definitely in function and probably in form as well. That means the types of species assemblies we use in pastures is probably going to have to change, because production alone is no longer enough. That's where we've been for the last 50 or 60 years, but the game is changing very dramatically. Why is it changing? Well, first of all, the standard or traditional pasture systems that we've used in New Zealand are starting to show some pretty serious cracks under the pressure of climate change. So I can assure you that climate change is real, particularly if you work with farmers in northern New Zealand, who are experiencing loss of pastures within 2 to 3 years after sowing. And much of that is climate driven. So we have an impending threat to the long-term productivity of what we've relied on for a very long period of time in New Zealand. So we need to respond to that. We also know that the productivity gains that we're getting year on year in, year out over the last, let's say, 25 years, the productivity gains are starting to slow. And some of the drivers of productivity in the past are losing or have lost their social acceptability. That is high rates of artificial nitrogen fertiliser use and high stocking rates. These are not things that that can continue to be used anywhere near the rate they've been used in the past. So if productivity is declining, even with the use of those tools, where do we go next? We have to reduce the environmental footprint of a large proportion, not all, but a large proportion of our grass-based pasture production systems, and we have the climate change pressure looming. We've recently been able to combine information from a number of sources to paint this picture in more detail, and I acknowledge a couple of my co-authors here today, also fellows of the Society, John Caritas and Stephen Goldson, who helped put this together. It's in our view, an overdue assessment of where we've reached and where we need to go. So how do we adapt within our means? Well, the key things that would appear to us to need urgent attention are some real clarity on what plant traits we're going to need in the future. We've been stuck in a production mentality for a very long period of time, but production is incompatible with footprint management and probably resilience. So we're going to have to look for other traits. How do we find those traits and how do we capture them efficiently? And some of the changes that are going to be needed in plant attributes are almost inconceivable if we don't have access to some of the new breeding technologies that are available. We don't need all of them necessarily, but some of them are going to be necessary in due course to help shift the dial on plant characteristics substantially. And we also know that a lot of our current management practices on farm have not kept pace with change. They haven't kept pace with climate change. They haven't kept pace with the types of phenotypes that are coming out of commercial plant breeding programs now. So there's a job of work to do there to address those. And there's a whole new domain of sensing and automation technologies that are coming on stream in all industries, but they're also extremely applicable in agriculture, which have great potential for addressing many of these issues that require information in order to be able to manage these complex systems accurately. So there's a great opportunity. The final point we would make is that, and I'll go right back to our competitive advantage, industries that are generating about 50% of our export income in our national income in exported goods, when you look at the data that's available on the status of our national pasture resource, it is very poor. And it's kind of incredible that, I mean, would Volvo Cars Board of Management sit there and say, hang on, we don't know anything about the safety characteristics or performance of our vehicles? No, they wouldn't. They'd know that intimately, and we don't. We know a fair bit. We don't know nothing. We know a fair bit, but there's some major gaps that we do not have our heads around. So thank you very much. That's it, and that's all there is to it. By the way, we should have that done by next week.
Yeah. Thanks, David. Another really impressive example of science doing it for New Zealand. And any questions for David? Rod?
Yeah.
And
just, with my book also, you mentioned new sensing techniques.
Yes.
Can you give an example of something that
Yep.
you think would make a huge difference?
Well, there's technologies that are available now and becoming commercially available. One example is using satellite imagery to estimate the amount of pasture that's present in a paddock on a farm, for example. Okay, and that's very useful information for those farmers, and we wish there were more of them like this, but those farmers who use that information to make good decisions about when they use fertiliser, when they graze, when they use supplementary feed. To get that information now, somebody on the farm staff has to go out, walk around the farm or drive around the farm and collect that information manually. If you can get satellite imagery instantaneously almost, that's accurate, then you have a powerful amount of information in front of you. That's one example. There are other automation examples, including what's known as virtual fencing, which is actually not a physical fence, but it's an electronic signal that is created between 2 points. Animals have transponders around their necks that warn them if they get near that so they can back off, and that is movable. So there's a whole way of subdividing and managing the grass in front of your animals that doesn't involve labour, and it means you can do it accurately. You start combining 2 of those things, 3 of those things, and you have a very powerful. So that is at, I would say, it's getting towards proof of practice stage now. It's probably past it, but the uptake is still quite low.
Richard, did you have a question? Yeah. Oh, just.
There you go. Yep. That's very interesting. I'm from the southeast Waikato. I'm probably one of the few people in this room who've actually helped milk a herd of cows. But anyway, the southeast Waikato, that was the famous bush sickness zone. And
yes.
Everybody in my school in Tokoroa, we learnt about the cobalt deficiency and all that history.
Yes.
And so it was ingrained in us. Do you think the dairy industry is doing enough to show New Zealanders its sheer importance? People who live in urban areas just don't have a clue about the significance of this. It's all right for us country boys, but it's a bit different from where I am now.
Good question. Is the dairy industry doing enough? Well, they're certainly not doing nothing. In fact, the size of the comms group and Dairy NZ in the time I was there grew to exceed that of the science group as a way of trying to, and I would say they've done it in a fair and rational way to put messages out there, good news stories, while also sometimes in language that's a bit couched, but also acknowledging that there are big work-ons that the industry needs to address, and giving examples of where that work-on is happening. It's actually quite tough, Richard, because we'd have to get into a discussion about the media and what sort of things grab the attention of the media. But if you look around, there are some good news stories that do get out on the media. And I would also say, of interest, Dairy NZ and other agricultural organisations do survey the general population quite regularly about their perceptions of the industry. And the surveys information that comes back actually says that by and large, the population supports what those industries are doing. So it's not as negative as you think. And part of our job has been working with farmers who get very down about it, right? And so have a look. Some of this information is saying there is actually widespread support. You just don't hear it. You hear the other story.
Thanks, David. I am going to, just because
he's my son, so he's no. Oh no, we've had these arguments at home.
Away you go. I guess my question is, on the whole, Dad, how well do you think we're using our land, like particular soil types, climates, for particular types of grazing systems? Is there more that we should be doing to use certain species or grazing management,
right,
or species of grass or whatever? It's given the soil types, especially as that's
good.
a big driver of those nutrients.
He knows his stuff, doesn't he? This was not
Was that a setup?
This is not a Dorothy Dixon. I'd say we could do a lot better. We do actually have in New Zealand a very good what's called land. I was going to say it's land information system, but it's not. I don't think it's quite the right word. That actually maps our soils and our topography. Yeah, it's not. It's still pretty broad brush, but that would tell you that if you overlaid some of those layers of, say, soil type, topography and so on versus land use, that you've got a mismatch in many cases. So yes, we could be doing more. The intensive horticultural industries, it'd be fantastic to see them growing, and they could certainly be using some of our better land. The other end of the scale, we've got some of our land going into trees that should not be going into trees. Really, we know this is another big public debate. But land is a scarce resource in this country, and the thought of it going into trees for repeated cycles of plantation forestry to mop up carbon is sending quite a few shivers through